Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Shifting Gears. My name's Greyson Harris. That's Carson Sharp over there. Today's episode is going to be, well, it's inspired actually by a recent event that happened here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Not a whole lot of newsworthy stuff happens in Chattanooga, Tennessee, so when it does happen, we know about it. And so this one happened at the Chattanooga airport. There's a FedEx plane there that had an emergency landing. Their landing gear basically just would not come down. Shortly after takeoff, they decided to turn around, and their landing was rough, but they pulled it off, skidded off the runway, plenty of sparks. No fire, apparently, and all three people on board were fine. But the whole situation caught our attention for a few different reasons. Number one, we're from Chattanooga. Some of us either live next to the airport or drive by it. One thing about that airport that is, there's a staple of that airport is that you always see what appears to be the same FedEx plane just in the same spot, parked all the time, every time you pass it. That's the plane that ultimately crashed, and I think the newsworthy part of it was, oh, that plane takes off, because we just never see it, at least during the daytime. Not very many of us are passing it overnight. And so that plane was taken off, and it was heading to Memphis. So why was it going to Memphis? FedEx is based out of, well, not based out of Memphis, but they kind of are based out of Memphis.
More or less. I mean, Memphis is their hub airport.
Exactly, yeah. And so FedEx and DHL and UPS and all of the other legacy airlines and freight airlines and all those other companies utilize one of two different models for scheduling flights and getting cargo from one destination to the next. Either a hub and spoke model, which is what FedEx, UPS, and all the big airlines use, or a point-to-point model. That one's usually reserved for the more low-cost airlines. And we'll get into both of those here in a minute, but let's explain first how a hub and spoke model works, because that's directly relevant to this FedEx plane that we've been referencing.
You mentioned, we all see that plane parked at Chattanooga Airport day in and day out, and it doesn't ever move. Mm-hmm. FedEx and UPS and most major freight airlines, for that matter, they operate all their flights at nighttime. Mm-hmm. So in the middle of the night, pilots will take off from all over the world. The freight doesn't move. If we're shipping a package from Chattanooga to San Francisco, for example, it's not going to move directly from Chattanooga to San Francisco. It doesn't make sense economically. So what they do is they have these hub cities or hub airports. And passenger airlines operate off the same model, as you mentioned, hub and spoke, mm-hmm. where they have one major central port or hub mm-hmm. where all their flights connect through. It's the same reason why when you get on a plane to go anywhere, you can't fly directly from Chattanooga to really anywhere except for Charlotte and Atlanta, because mm-hmm. those are the two major hubs of the two major airlines that fly out of here. Yeah. So the FedEx flight was flying from Chattanooga to the FedEx World Hub in Memphis, Tennessee.
In FedEx, Tennessee,
exactly.
Yeah.
And from there, the freight would be offloaded of the airplane from Chattanooga, sorted, and loaded back onto planes to final destinations throughout the country, right. and ultimately around the world.
Yeah, and that Chattanooga plane wasn't the only one heading to Memphis that night. There would have been tens of possibly hundreds of planes.
Easily, yeah. or more. The FedEx terminal in Memphis mm-hmm. is 4 to 5 times bigger than the passenger terminal. If that gives you
and Memphis is not a big town, relatively speaking. A city of, a little under 1 million people. You may be wondering, okay, why set up a hub in Memphis, Tennessee, of all places? Well, it makes a lot of sense when you actually think about it. It may not be the geographic center of the U.S., but it is the population center. Well, close to the population center of the U.S. It's about 100 or 200 miles away from the actual population center, which is in Missouri. It is strategically located to be able to be that super hub that you mentioned, mm-hmm. where all of these flights will come in from these smaller towns or smaller cities to essentially use that hub as a sorting and distribution center, right?
Yeah, and like you mentioned, the Memphis and for UPS, Louisville, Kentucky.
That's right.
They're all relatively close to the main population center of the U.S. So those two sorting areas or hubs are closest to the most amount of people. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially why they build their hubs in Louisville and Memphis, which relatively are still small cities, but they can reach the most amount of people the quickest.
And so what happens then when it goes to Memphis? Well, the plane will land, or the planes in this case. You'll have planes taking off from their origin from, anywhere from 10 p.m. to midnight. They're landing around 1 a.m. midnight, and then everything gets taken off the planes, and then in a fairly quick process, actually, all of the packages are then scanned and then sorted and moved into the respective planes that they need to be on to go to their destination. It's gotten down to a pretty quick science. The technology involved in that makes it pretty fast, but that's also why it's important that they all show up at the same time, is because a package that's on your plane right now will likely not be on your plane again after you get to Memphis. There's no particular reason for that. That's why they all have to be there at the same time so that they can make that transition smoothly.
Right. These airlines stack their arrivals and departures strategically so that everything arrives all at the same time and everything departs not all at the same time, but over a very short amount of time. And that's a key to the hub and spoke model, as we mentioned. It allows you to more efficiently utilize your assets as a company. So your aircraft, your air crews, your ground crews, everything is more efficiently utilized during that short amount of time rather than paying people to sit around and wait on planes to show up sporadically throughout the day.
Yeah.
It maximizes profits for these airlines when they operate in a short window, as you mentioned.
Right. So then what happens then if we're shipping something to a small town that's not near one of the hubs? Well, that's where intermodal stuff comes in. You may be transferring to a smaller plane, like a propeller plane. You may be taking the package off of that and putting it on a delivery van, and then that's when it goes. So there are levels to this. It's not like you're going to fly a giant freighter plane into some podunk town. Right.
So for example, the jet that FedEx was operating out of Chattanooga Airport, it was a Boeing 757-200. It's a fairly large aircraft, especially for Chattanooga. Passenger airlines don't operate planes that large out of this airport. But the reason that it's justifiable is because it's a freight aircraft.
Yeah.
So the freight airlines make their money by utilizing their aircrafts at different time periods. So for example, passenger airline, they're only really making money when their assets are in the air. So when a plane is parked on the ground, the plane is not making the airline any money. Passenger airlines try to turn and burn. They try to land the plane, offload it, refuel it, reload it, and get it gone. The freight aircrafts are different. We already mentioned they operate at nighttime in a relatively short window.
Right.
They also utilize older, less efficient aircraft. For example, the DC-10 or the MD-11 that are no longer flying, at least major airlines in the U.S. However, if you look at UPS or FedEx, they're still flying these older, more inefficient aircraft.
Got hundreds of them.
Hundreds of them.
Yeah, it's basically their whole fleet.
They're still in operation regularly with the freight carriers, and it's because they can still make money with an old, inefficient airplane because of the fact that it's not flying all day long.
Yeah, they don't have to justify using it to sort of offset their costs. For example, that FedEx plane in Chattanooga, it can sit for 16, 17 hours a day, and that's totally fine. Whereas if it were a passenger airplane, that business would go out of business because it simply would not be able to ever cover the costs of these millions of dollars of airplanes.
Right, and airplanes are not cheap to buy, and they're definitely not cheap to operate.
Yeah.
Which is, again, why they buy the UPS, FedEx, DHL, why they operate older aircraft, is they're cheaper, but because they're older, they have more fuel burn, which costs more money. But if you're not flying them all day long, it's irrelevant. If the airplane's sitting on the ground 70% of the time, your fuel burn doesn't matter as much to you as it would to a passenger airplane who've transitioned to newer, more efficient airplanes such as the Boeing 787, the Airbus A350.
And another interesting end of it too, you're mentioning fuel. Fuel is a very precious commodity when it comes to air freight, because basically, let's think of it this way. Say you're trying to ship something from the United States to Asia. Well, with today's modern airplanes getting across the Pacific Ocean, that's not really an issue. However, obviously, you're going to need more fuel to do that. More fuel equals less cargo. So how do some of these freight companies basically circumnavigate that? Well, you wouldn't believe it, but Anchorage, Alaska is actually a big deal when it comes to this stuff, because the way the curvature of the earth works, if you're heading to, somewhere in China, for instance, you're basically going to be flying right over Anchorage, Alaska. So what that allows is for these freight companies to use it as another hub, essentially, to refuel, to shift out cargo. I mean, if they don't have enough to fill it on a plane, they can just basically leave it there and wait and send it on another plane.
As you mentioned, it's a perfect stopover point from from Asia Pacific to North America. You fly right over it. So modern aircraft are perfectly capable to make a nonstop trip from mainland Asia to the United States. But with the freight aircraft, it's not necessarily about the quickest turnaround time. Well, at the end of the day, it is.
Kind of.
But like you mentioned, Anchorage is a perfect stopover point because they can carry more freight because they don't have to carry as much fuel. And Anchorage not only is a refueling stop, but it's also a perfect place to offload the aircraft and sort the packages so that they can get on the right routing once they do head to North America.
Right. And so for the most part, the hub model works really well for, well, basically having redundancies, I would say, because, think of it this way. We'll talk now in terms of passenger aircraft. If you are connecting at one of the hubs, I'll say in Denver, for instance, right? Say you're flying into Denver to connect there and fly to Seattle. With this hub and spoke model, if there is a problem with one of the other planes, if there's a delay, if there is a legitimate mechanical issue with one of the planes, it's pretty easy for you as a passenger to still get through your day just fine. There will probably be another flight for you to get on. They can even bring in another plane, depending on how big the hub is. They might just have spares basically hanging around. And so it works out well in that instance. But when it comes to freight, most of the time it works, but there are some times when it is relatively inefficient. And that usually comes with when you're trying to ship something from like a mid-level city to another mid-level city that is like just a little bit out of the way of a hub.
I guess you're speaking of when you're shipping from a market with low demand to another market with relatively low demand.
I'll word it differently. If there is not enough demand to send an entire plane to a city, but there is still packages there, you might have to backtrack a little bit because that package will probably have to go to the hub to get on another plane that actually is bound for that destination full of cargo. You know what I'm saying now?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So geographically, it may not make sense to go to the hub, but at the end of the day, economically for the freight carrier, it definitely makes sense.
Right. And so the point-to-point system basically just skips all of that, which is why they usually operate out of the smaller airports, and you'll usually find some of the low-cost airlines utilizing this model for good reason. And some not so great reasons as well. I think one of the interesting things about that point-to-point system is just how delicate it is, because if you are on a connecting flight going somewhere and there's a problem with there's a plane gets delayed or whatever, it's messing up the entire link of the chain at that point. There really isn't much of any redundancies in place or any backup plans for the most part. You're just kind of hoping that everything goes smoothly.
The main differences point-to-point versus hub and spoke is the point-to-point, it's used between two markets where the cities are relatively small. I think you mentioned that.
Right.
It's used between two cities where demand is high, but the total number of cities served by the airline is small. Overall. Now, conversely, with the hub and spoke model, the distance between two cities or two markets is large. The demand between the two cities is low, but the total number of cities served by the airline is large.
So one of the things I was going to say about the point-to-point system is that it can be a lot more efficient, right? You don't have to worry so much about connecting flights. It's usually a direct flight. But the thing about it is that you're not usually going to find Delta, American, United, any of the legacy airlines doing anything like that. If you get on a Delta, United, American flight, whatever, you're more than likely going to one of their hubs. You kind of just, because that's really all they fly to, is from hubs to that other airport and then right back. Usually how that one goes, but at least with the point-to-point system, you've got a little bit more freedom there, but it also comes with, some sacrifices as well. You're not going to get the same quality of product, of service, just because, again, these are low-cost airlines trying to, again, be budget airlines.
But one of the benefits to point is typically you have a single type of aircraft within your fleet, meaning there's less training cost involved in training your pilots.
Keep the same crew and the same pilots.
Exactly, same
Everybody
pilots.
knows.
Your ground staff is only trained on one aircraft. Your mechanics and all of your maintenance is just geared towards one type of aircraft, which lowers your cost significantly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it limits your connectivity with longer routes, which, as you know, Southwest, you're flying mostly within the United States.
I have a question. What's the process like when something like that happens, like an emergency landing?
Yeah.
Where do they start sorting all the packages? Like, are they just like throw these all away? They're destroyed.
The question was, when there is an emergency landing, like exactly what happened in Chattanooga not too long ago, what happens with the cargo on board? A lot of this may be speculation, to be completely honest, but I think the number one is to secure any people that are on the plane. First
Yeah, I
and
would
foremost.
hope. Yeah.
Now, secondly, you have to make sure it's a safe area to work. Everybody's safe. But of course, all that freight's going to be offloaded, and not long afterwards, a new airplane is going to be sent in, most likely from the hub, Memphis, and that freight's going to be loaded back onto a new airplane, and it's going to continue like nothing ever happened.
At most, they were probably just delayed a few hours.
Oh yeah, at most
Right.
they'll delay it a few hours, check and make sure there's no major damage to anything, and
Yeah.
just keep on rolling.
Yeah, but for the most part, yeah, like you said, everything just kind of keeps going. It's not like, oh, the Chattanooga airplane didn't show up, so I guess we have to wait on it, and we'll just sit here.
Yeah.
Well, no, they're going to be super proactive about it. They'll send their own plane, and then honestly, all that cargo will probably just have to get sorted the next day, just because they've already missed that window.
Yeah,
Like,
certainly-
they'll go ahead and send it, and that's fine. So, like, there's going to be some packages that show up late, but the whole system doesn't crash and burn because of the way it's set up, where it's there's not any one single point of failure.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned one single point of failure. Now, with hub and spoke, which FedEx operates, hub and spoke is actually more vulnerable to a cascading domino effect of delays versus point to point. Reason being, like this flight in Chattanooga,
Right.
if the plane doesn't show up when it's scheduled, that can ripple through a hub and spoke network.
Yeah.
So especially if you relate it to passenger aircraft. So if your flight is delayed getting into the hub, you're probably going to miss your connection. So you can see how it'll ripple out. And not only you are going to miss your connection, but everybody on your flight that was delayed is going to miss the connection. Now, we translate this back to the cargo aircraft. All that freight that was supposed to be sorted that night in Memphis definitely didn't get sorted. And probably the next day at best.
Yeah.
So it can cause significant delays throughout the network. Point to point, you don't necessarily have that ripple effect, but at the same time, it's a little bit more difficult to access a broader network without scaling up your business exponentially
Well,
to
I
do so.
think I don't know if maybe I'm viewing the hub and spoke model and the point-to-point system differently, because I view it almost the complete opposite.
Okay.
Where with hub and spoke, if the plane doesn't show up for the connecting flight, if you're in one of the hubs, which you would kind of have to be in this scenario, they are going to have more backups. Like they're going to have, like, here's a plane we can just pull out of here if that's legitimately the case. There are other flights that get delayed and moved around. So at this hub, at least you have all these assets that they can mobilize to fix the situation. But with point to point, if the plane that I'm supposed to be getting on in St. Louis to go to Detroit never showed up to St. Louis because it got delayed in Memphis, then I'm not going to Detroit now because that plane's not there.
Yeah,
But with hub and spoke, there's some options. Like I can at least, there's some other, there might be another plane hours later that's actually still going there because that's so big of a hub. But with point to point, I just feel like if you get screwed there, you have less like additional resources to lean on.
And you're right. I think we all heard the horrific incident on board the Delta flight where there's a passenger that had an accident throughout the cabin.
Oh, yeah, an accident? Is that how we want to
Yeah,
describe it?
we'll call it an accident throughout the cabin.
They had a explosive evacuation.
Yeah, to say the least.
You were talking about the one where the girl was like,
That guy.
mother is not real.
On that flight, they were nearly halfway to their destination, and Delta told the pilots to return to Atlanta. So the reason being is Delta's major hub is in Atlanta,
Yeah.
and they definitely had the assets to clean up the issue. But instead of just telling them to divert to an airport that they were essentially over,
Right.
they had them turn all the way around and come all the way back to Atlanta. As you mentioned, it's likely because of their infrastructure in Atlanta, they could deal with the problem more efficiently. I think to sum it all up, we'll name, I guess, some pros and cons of each. So a pro of the point-to-point system is you have high schedule reliability because you don't have that ripple effect that you do with delays in the hub and spoke model. Additionally, you have a reduction in total travel time because you're moving from your point of origin to your point of destination.
Yeah.
You're not transitioning through a hub, going out of your way and then coming back.
Right.
So your total travel time is down. Now, cons of point to point, you have low frequency of flights per day, and there's not a whole lot of options for connecting flights. So you're pretty limited in where you can go to and where you can go from. Now, with hub and spoke, there are a lower number of routes needed to connect all the cities within your network. I think we mentioned this earlier.
Right.
And that's huge for scalability. Additionally, hub and spoke is much more scalable than your point-to-point system. However, again, congestion or delays at certain airports can ripple through the system. There's lower schedule reliability because of this. There's also and not necessarily from a passenger standpoint, but from the airline standpoint, route planning is a lot more complicated because you're routing flights through the major hub. So, it's 6 in one hand, half a dozen in the other, depending on what you're doing and what your goals are, will determine and I guess your business model as well, determine what model you select.
Yeah. And this is going to be something that I hope all of you guys remember next time you're at the airport. And here's why. You may notice, if you're there long enough, that the airport is extremely busy, and then it's not. And then it's kind of dead. And it's real busy again, and then it's dead. Well, now you know why. It's because of the hub and spoke model for the most part. Everybody's showing up and leaving at the same time for the most part because they're trying to connect everything and send people on their way. And, well, it's the same way with packages. They just try to get them all there at the same time, distribute them, sort them, get them on their planes, get them to your front door. It is an extremely, well, when you look at it plainly, it's actually a simple process. However, it's a huge undertaking. One of the more logistically insane things that we've, as a country, have figured out somehow is just how to ship things overnight, no matter where you are. Frankly, I find the whole model fascinating, and it's something that, now I think I'm going to notice a lot more next time I travel.
Yeah, definitely something to pay attention to. Hopefully you guys got something out of this, and I guess hopefully learned something as well.
Yeah, well, that's the goal here, for y'all to learn something. So thank you guys for joining us. If you have any ideas for future episodes or topics, let us know in the comments. But in the meantime, we'll see you guys next time. Bye.
See ya.
Bye.